So, Natasha Crain, welcome to this interview with me and Apologia, and thank you for being available.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure.
We're very happy to have translated "Keeping Your Kids on God's Side," and everyone can see actually a Swedish copy in the background there of Rusta, dina I don't know if you'd like to try pronouncing it.
Okay, let's see. Rusta, dina
Oh, that's great. It's perfect. I thought we'd start with some background. How did you become a writer of Christian apologetics, and what has that got to do with your own story as a mother?
Yeah, well, I grew up in a Christian family, and so I've been a Christian my whole life, but I never took my faith all that seriously. It was just something that I did because my family did it, and we went to church every Sunday. And so I was very much what we would call nominal Christian.
Right.
And it wasn't really until when my husband and I had kids that we started thinking, we need to think more deeply about this. We need to take this more seriously. And so as part of that, I decided to start a blog back in 2011 because I thought, this will help me to make sure that I am thinking about it. It was a Christian parenting blog, and I was just writing blog posts to kind of share what we were doing with our young kids to help them know about Jesus. It was really that simple. And I had 3 kids who were 3 and under at the time, so very little. And I was just writing things about devotions and songs and very simple things. But as people began to share my blog posts over time, I started getting a lot of skeptics of Christianity coming to my website. And I have to emphasize, I wasn't looking to get into any kind of debate. I wasn't looking to engage with big questions about faith. I couldn't have answered them if I had wanted to. But I started getting people coming to my site and leaving comments like, there's no evidence that God exists. Science has disproved God's existence. Jesus was never even a person in history. The Bible, it's filled with errors and contradictions. So many things that even growing up in church, I had never really heard or had the chance to process. And so I realized at that time that my kids were growing up in a very, very different world than the one in which I grew up. And so I started looking for answers. I started reading a lot of books, and I started listening to things and watching things. And as I was equipping myself with this understanding of apologetics, which is just how we make a case for and defend the truth of Christianity, I turned around and was writing about it on my blog. And I was telling other parents, hey, here's what I'm discovering. This person came to my site. Here's what they're saying. I didn't know what to make of it, but looking for some answers, this is what I found. And so over time, I just gained a much deeper knowledge of apologetics as I was equipping myself and equipping others. And eventually, a few years down the line, that led to the opportunity where a publisher came and said, hey, do you want to write a book for parents about this? Because there have always been a lot of apologetics books that are out there, really wonderful apologetics books. But a lot of times parents feel overwhelmed by this subject. They don't even know the subject exists a lot of the time. And so my goal in writing my first book, which is Rusta, dina was to help parents to really understand these are 40 of the biggest questions that the secular world is going to press your kids with that you need to understand. And here are some easy to grasp answers in 4 to 5 pages each. So that's really how I got into this. It wasn't that I started off wanting to be a writer or speaker or anything like that. It's just God brought me on this journey through what I experienced on my blog.
Well, that's interesting. It's I didn't even think of that, but how it's easy as a parent to, you draw on your own experience growing up, but a lot can change over the course of a generation so that our kids don't necessarily share the kind of context that we were in as children. So it's I guess that's a discovery we're all going to make in different, aspects as our children get older. That's interesting.
That is so true. And I think that, that parents too often assume that their kids are growing up in the same environment.
Yeah.
And I think that's half the battle, especially when I do beginnings and things like that, to help parents to see that you might not think all this stuff is needed, all these answers and these questions that we're talking about just because you don't engage with them. But that doesn't mean your kids aren't engaging with them. And I guarantee you that as you start to look into what people are saying and how kids are today are engaging in social media and everything that the internet has put in front of them, they are 100% growing up in a totally different world than most of us grew up in. So we can't just draw on our own experience and extrapolate from that and say, well, my kids need this or that. We need to do what they need, not what we think they need based on what we needed at a given time.
That's a really good point. Thanks. So if I did the math correctly, you're a mother of teenagers now. Is that
not quite, but
not
almost.
Quite? So, almost, okay.
So I have twins who just turned 12, and I have a 10-year-old.
Okay. Right on the cusp of teenage years. Well, exciting.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask, what are some of the questions that your children have asked you that stumped you the most? And I think especially, how did you learn how to respond, or how did you learn where to go to find answers, and even I guess learn to give those answers in a way that they could understand and relate to?
Yeah, well, we've been really open in our house talking about apologetics types of things since they were little. So the one thing that's been important in our house is that we've tried to establish this environment where questions are always good. They're always not just okay, but they're good. We want you to ask them. And we're very forthright that people have a lot of different beliefs in the world, but I've tried to teach them ever since they were little, I never, ever want you to believe in Jesus just because I do. I want you to believe in Jesus because you know that Jesus is the truth. And so in my life, I'm going to teach you as you grow up how to pursue truth. How do you discover what is true? So that's the foundation that we've set. So within that, our kids ask a lot of questions, but a lot of times it's in the context of us bringing up things to them that maybe they haven't thought about. And I think that's why a book like this is so important, because sometimes parents don't even know the questions their kids are going to ask, and they're trying to answer questions that their kids aren't even going to get. Maybe, just basic Sunday school types of things, which are important, but they're not going to prepare their kids for this world. So, I can think of one question, for example, about when my daughter asked me, well, why did John the Baptist, even baptize Jesus? Jesus didn't need his sins washed away, for example.
Yeah.
And, you get a question like this, and that's more of a theological question than an apologetics type of question. But it stands out to me because I had already been studying a lot of apologetics for a bit of time when she asked this. And I kind of felt like, I know the answers, but you'll never know every answer to everything. And that's okay. And I want parents to know that when you get the question, I told her, I said, you know what, I actually haven't thought about that so much. I'm not sure exactly what the right answer to that question would be. And I told her, that's such a great question. I'm glad you're asking it. Always give your kids praise for the questions they bring up so they know this is a good thing. Yeah. And then, I talked about, well, how do you look for a good answer? Do we just type it into Google and see what comes up? Do we go to maybe a study Bible? Do you go to a commentary? So teaching our kids tools are very important, because the one tool every kid knows they have is the internet. But the internet is not going to be the arbiter of truth. They have to understand it's just a vast pile of information out there. So we want to help them understand, how do you use commentary? How do you use a Bible, a study Bible? How do you use these things? And so we can look those things up together. But I think that's kind of the key when kids do ask questions, to say, this is great, I'm so glad you're asking. And then don't run off and find an answer on your own and come back. You're not the question and answer person. You want to go with them and say, let's find these answers so that they see how to do it. And it's not a knock on your credibility. I think a lot of times when I talk to parents, they think, oh, but I'm going to look like I don't know something to my kids. But it's not that. And it's good to demonstrate that, none of us has every answer. And we need to be able to look for good answers.
Yeah. Well, that really taps into actually what I wanted to ask you next. And it has to do with curiosity, which for me as a parent, it's one of the things I really want to cultivate. And it's already there naturally in kids. They're just naturally curious about anything and everything. And you notice whenever you read the Gospels that Jesus is often happy to respond to a question with more questions. So as a parent, how do you look at the balance between sort of giving your children straight answers to questions versus maybe, giving another question back or ask, well, what do you think? Or, just basically helping them come to their own conclusion, and maybe even, once they get older, because this is certainly something that, needs to evolve with age, but how do you help them to think critically, look for, come up with maybe options and then excluding ones that don't make sense and that kind of thing? And how often would you just respond, well, here's the answer?
Yeah, well, those were a lot of good questions right there. I'll see if I can hit on some of them. But I think that's such a good point that you don't want your kids. I think sometimes parents want to be the resource, to their kids. Come to me, I will have the answer. But what you're saying, which is such a good point, is that if we're always doing that, then our kids aren't going to really process along the answers, right? And so I think that it is so important that instead of just seeing it as, let me give you an answer to something, that we can ask the question back and maybe say, well, what are some possible answers to that? And have them come up with the possibilities. And I think that some kids might be resistant to that because I know that's a personality type thing too, because I have kids with different personalities and we have to be sensitive to that. I have one child, for example, who if I were to press her to come up with lots of possibilities, she would just say, I don't know, because she doesn't want to possibly be wrong. And so sometimes we can intimidate kids, I think, by trying to get them to think out loud in those kinds of ways. And if that's where they are at this point in time, that's okay. And I think that, we can pull them along and maybe explain some thinking as we give the answer, even if they're not willing to process out loud. So that's
Sure.
One type of child. But then other kids are more than willing to, process that and say, well, it could be this or it could be that, and drawing out those answers, and then have them think through, well, how would you find out which of these answers is the case? And so helping them not just figure out possibilities, but also figure out how do you distinguish between the possibilities, because that gets back to what we were talking about before. How do you find the answer, which is really important. And then I think that there are some times when they're just asking a very factual type of question, that you're just going to answer because it's not a big picture thinking question. Like my kids and we've been reading the Christmas narratives this week in our homeschool. And so it's, well, which two gospels tell the Christmas story, right? Well, that's just a flat answer. That's just not trying to come up with possibilities. That's just, it's in Matthew and Luke, for example. So I think it depends on the nature of the question, but it is really, really helpful to get kids to process the possibilities.
Yeah. I appreciate what you say about not becoming the answer person, because ideally you establish, good rapport and you have a lot of credibility, with your child and they'll keep coming to you, but there will also naturally be, there'll be a time of transition where you're not the authority on everything anymore as a parent. And so it's good for them to develop strategies to look for answers themselves elsewhere. So I also wanted to ask you, there are things that children bring up and they're gonna, just bombard you with questions when you're a parent. But how do you discern between the things that you just kind of wait for your children to bring up and the things that you as a parent need to bring up, the conversations that you need to initiate? And what have you learned about when and how to bring those things up?
Yeah, I think that this is one of the most important things that I hope parents will get from the book, actually, is to know that these are the questions that are so important today. There are literally, thousands of possible questions and conversations we can have with our kids about faith. And some of them come very naturally to us as parents because maybe they're things we've grappled with, like maybe we've thought a lot about the nature of prayer, or that's something that we struggled with. So we feel comfortable. That's our zone of talking with our kids. And so then we're focusing our talks on that. But if we're going to prepare them for a very secular world that has no belief in Jesus and the authority of the Bible, any of the basics of Christianity, they have to know so much more. They're going to have to know some specific things. And so that before I had started writing this book, it all kind of came about because I wrote a blog post and it was called 65 Apologetics Questions questions every Christian parent needs to be prepared to answer. There
Sounds
were no
like a lot.
answers. Yes, there were no answers given in the blog post. It was just a list of questions.
Yeah.
And it was my first viral blog post ever. It was shared thousands and thousands of times. And that was an eye-opening moment for me, because I realized that parents, it's not just answers that they need to know the questions. They need to know what to bring up. So it's so important we don't see our role as just, okay, let me research everything I can to be prepared to answer questions. It's, I need to understand the questions that will confront our kids eventually, whether they bring them to me or not. And then I need to put them in front of my kids. And I know some parents are afraid that will make their kids doubt, but they're going to hit these questions out there eventually, whether you bring them up or not. And so it's like a lot of other questions in life. We don't wait until the world teaches our kids about a lot of things. We say, no, that's something that I, as a parent, am going to talk about with my kids. It's the same thing with faith. We don't need some person to come along who says, oh, didn't you know there's no evidence for God's existence, and shake our kids' faith before we say, oh, did you want to talk about the evidence for God's existence, son? No, that's not how it works. We need to understand that in today's world, there are a lot of people who are hostile to even the idea that God exists. And we need to be prepared to come to our kids and say, hey, we need to talk about, how do we even know God exists? It's nice and all that we're reading these Bible verses and memorizing Bible verses and going to church, but like, what if God doesn't even exist, as a lot of people claim? How do we even begin to think through that? So I think that there are questions that we just have to bring forward to our kids. And that's really been my mission with this book. And I have 2 other books also that follow up to this. There's Talking with Your Kids About God, which focuses on 30 questions just about God's existence. And then Talking with Your Kids About Jesus, which is 30 questions about Jesus specifically, his identity and the meaning of his death and evidence for the resurrection, these kinds of questions. So altogether, I cover 100 of these questions across 3 books to help parents see that this is what we should bring to our kids. And even if you bring 100 questions to your kids, they're still going to have other questions. And part of the beauty of bringing the questions to them is it leads to more questions. So whenever a parent says to me, gosh, my kids don't really ask questions about faith, I don't know that they're that interested, they probably haven't brought many questions to their kids either. Because as soon as you do and you start opening that up, then kids will open up too.
Right. So whenever it comes to when it comes to having conversations with your children about faith, I guess there's such a familiar pop cultural trope about having the talk with your kids when it comes to matters of sexuality, and how it's like a failed attempt and then that's it, no more. How do you avoid having conversations about your faith that feel like forced, let's have a conversation? And like, what are the situations, if you get really practical, what are some of the situations that you've found, the most helpful or the most natural to have conversations? I know I saw on your blog, you compared it to something you called low-grade tidying, which I thought was a fun comparison. So can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah. So by low grade tidying, one day I was on scrolling through Facebook and I saw this article, and it was like 5 things that tidy people don't do. And I struggle with messiness. It's very hard for me to keep a clean house. And so I thought I have to read this article. So I go on to it, and it really had a couple of brilliant insights, surprisingly, for something you just see randomly on Facebook. But one of them was that tidy people don't get their house clean in one fell swoop, where it's just, we're going to spend hours upon hours of doing this. That's too overwhelming. Instead, tidy people develop these little habits of what the article called low grade tidying, where they're constantly in this state of just picking things up a little by little all the time. And I just thought that was such a valuable insight for how we have these conversations with our kids, because sometimes parents, especially if their kids are already older, maybe you have a 14-year-old, for example, and they're like, oh my goodness, like I haven't been having these these conversations. This seems way too overwhelming. Well, that's looking at it like cleaning in one fell swoop. But anyone at any time can begin the process of low grade tidying, where they're just having little bits and pieces of conversation as you go. But here's the key. You cannot do low grade tidying if you're not equipped yourself. And I think that is the part that parents miss, because especially if they're not familiar with these kinds of subjects, they think to themselves, but how, like, where do you get ideas? Like, how do you know?
Yeah.
You become equipped and you read a book like this one or other apologetics books, and you start to process the kinds of challenges that you see. It is not hard at all to find examples in the secular world around us. It's just, they're everywhere. You see it all the time. So when you're equipped as a parent, then you will have what I call your worldview radar up. It's kind of like you always notice these things because now you're attuned to them. Whereas before, maybe you didn't notice these examples. And so just to give a couple of practical examples, I was sitting in Starbucks one day. You guys have Starbucks, right?
There's a couple of them, yeah.
Okay, I don't know.
And lots of equivalents.
Okay, so a coffee shop. We'll call it a coffee shop.
Tons of those.
Okay, so sitting in a coffee shop one day, and they have they had like this big board. It was before the year was about to start, and it was inviting people to put up their best advice for the new year, for example. And so people had written all kinds of things, and they were so secular in nature. It was all very much like, listen to your heart and follow your dreams, be who you want to be. Just these messages that in our family we call bad secular wisdom.
It sounds like a Disney movie to me.
Oh, exactly. All you have to do for practical examples is watch a Disney movie, really. Yeah. But so if you look at these examples, you just think to yourself, none of these are really consistent with a Christian worldview. So I took a picture of it, of this bulletin board, and I brought it home to my kids. And I said, look at the advice that people have. And you could see the same types of things over and over that people were saying. And I asked my kids, what do you think of these? Do you think that these are, which ones, not let's criticize everything, but which ones are consistent with a Christian worldview? Which ones aren't? Following your heart, that's not consistent with a Christian worldview. As much as people like to say that, the Bible says the heart is deceitful above all things, right? We don't want to follow our hearts because our hearts, we have a sin nature. So really helping our kids process that and discern those differences everywhere they go gives them the worldview radar. And so there are so many examples that you see like that in movies, like you just said. You can absolutely find a million examples, or things that famous people say. This, you see this all the time in the news. We just had a presidential election, and it just made for an infinite number of examples of things that people say and how people process. So there are so many possibilities, but really the first step is to equip yourself, and then you start seeing these everywhere.
Oh, that's great advice. Thanks. So I wanted to ask you in terms of helping our kids themselves to develop, their own relationship with God and develop their habits, spiritual disciplines, whatever you want to call it, Bible reading, praying for themselves, that kind of thing. Can you describe, if you have a certain approach to that, or some tips for that, maybe what age, certain specific tips for certain ages or something like that?
Yeah, this is a challenge, I think, for any parent, because the vast majority of parents I know, if not all of them, would say that their kids are not, reading the Bible with a passion every day of their lives. I mean, that is just really rare for kids, because there are so many things that are distracting them or competing for their time, that kind of thing. I think devotionals can be a gateway into that, so that there's something that they're coming back to that's easy to read, each night. But devotionals, we have to understand, can't be a replacement for the Bible either. They're not very meaty, and a lot of times they, even border on theologically inaccurate. They're just so broad that it becomes, I don't want to say worthless, but it doesn't do what the Bible should do in terms of reading the word. But that said, it's also hard for young kids to read the Bible themselves. And so I actually don't remember which book I used this example in, but when I had the conversation with my kids when they were about 7, and I told them, you know what, you're getting big enough now that you need to see how you can start to read the Bible a little bit. They were already reading, and that was fine. And I encouraged them to open, up the Bible and to read that night. And so I came in, and the good news is they listened. They were young enough where they cared what I suggested. But then when I came in, one of my kids was saying that he's reading Ezekiel, and my daughter's reading Isaiah at age 7.
Out of all the books in the Bible they could pick. That's a fascinating choice.
Yes, I know. And it sounds so obvious in retrospect. Like, how did I not give them more guidance? Right. It was kind of this parenting fail moment where the intent was there. I had the right intent to get them to read, but it just didn't even occur to me that they're going to just plop the Bible open, which of course they would. So I think that if we're going to encourage our kids to read the Bible, which they should, we have to really give them guidance on it and help them understand, not just, here's a Bible verse, but, how is the Bible structured? Well, what's the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament? We have 4 biographies of Jesus written from 4 different views. Those are the Gospels. And then we have letters written after Jesus' death. Even that structure that I just described that very briefly, after hundreds of hours in church as a kid, I didn't even really understand that. And I had very faithful parents who love the Lord. I went to a biblically solid church, but no one ever talked about the structure of the Bible or how to read the Bible. And so I didn't even realize that. I thought that the Gospels, I never read them for myself. I thought they were just sequential, like, a 4-part book of Jesus's life or something. I didn't even know that they overlapped in parts and things like that. So giving kids that time to understand this is how things are structured so they know how to read, and then reading it with them. I think that kind of comes first, because it's hard to understand in parts, and there's so much of the context and the richness that they miss if they're not having you to do some of that guidance. And so while I think it's great and it's an ideal to try to get your kids toward a point of reading every night on their own, probably not totally realistic for a lot of kids. But as parents, I would say set aside the time each week, like we've always had the Bible study time, and just start with half an hour a week. That's not overwhelming for anyone. Your kids will fight it probably if they're not used to this already, which if you have young kids and you're listening, start this when they're young, because then it just becomes part of your family environment. This is just what your family does, and they won't be as hesitant. But even if they're older, you can get to a point of just saying, you know what? We should have been doing this, and we're going to start now because we haven't before. And even if they moan and complain, you give them a time limit. This has been very helpful for us, because it's not like kids, even when they're used to it, are super happy all the time about doing this. But we say this is half an hour. That's what you can expect. It's going to be half an hour. It's not going to be less. It's not going to be more. When they have that in their head, it's a lot easier to have their attention. And then during that time, you can walk through and we just read a verse at a time. Well, what does that mean? What is he saying? Who wrote this again? Who's he writing to again? What's the context of what he's saying? So reading it with them will help set them up so that they actually understand what they're reading, so that they'll want to read later, because nothing's more discouraging than sitting down to read the Bible and thinking, I don't get this. I'm not going to do it anymore.
Right. That's great. So how about our kids in school settings or sports teams, whatever setting outside of the home, and they're among non-Christian friends? How can we help them express their faith and maybe, in general, express personal views that flow from their faith? I find as a parent, I so much want to protect my children. There could be a tendency to, obviously I want them to express their faith, but it also makes me sad. It makes me feel maybe almost a little bit guilty if I know that's going to put them in difficult situations. They're going to have to suffer for their faith in some sense, maybe very mild, but still. What's your thinking on how we help equip our kids to express their faith in settings where they're going to be challenged?
Right. Well, it's a tough question, and it's a big question because it can take on a lot of different forms and a lot of settings. So I'll
Yeah.
kind of give a broad answer in general. But I think that actually, I think this is why exposing your kids to apologetics from a young age is actually so important. Not even because they're going to be out there, giving the best arguments for the existence of God, even though that would be great and it will come in useful for them to know that. That's not
Yeah.
even the reason. And I think parents misunderstand this. So hear me out. I think that the biggest, greatest reason is to give your kids the confidence of knowing that what they believe is true. When you have a confidence that this isn't just a thought, or it's not just a feeling, it's what kind of makes sense, or it's the church I went to, or my parents believe this, but that you've actually learned that there's good reason, good objective evidence that this is actually true, then you suddenly have a different kind of confidence. Then when you're in a tough situation, you have the confidence of knowing, well, this is true. This is true. So I'm willing to stand up for it. That willingness is huge because a lot of kids, they don't have the knowledge of how to do it, but just the fact that they're willing to, because they're so confident that Jesus is truth, that's a whole other step. So I think that's what we miss a lot of times, that distinction between willingness and ability. And apologetics gives kids both the willingness and eventually the ability. So even if your child is, 8 years old on the playground and they can't articulate all of these, specific apologetics concepts, the fact you've introduced them to this concept that God hasn't just made things a blind belief. He doesn't expect us to just kind of guess that he's there and then go forward. He's given us all this kinds of evidence, and we can discover that it's actually true, and that not every religion can be true, that we can actually search for what God has revealed. It makes such a difference. And then I think that when kids have that willingness and that confidence, then as they get older, they're more able to engage in those conversations. Maybe when they're younger, it just looks like a willingness to invite a friend to church because they're convicted that this is true, and not just true, but beautiful, that Christianity is a beautiful thing worth checking out.
Yeah.
And apologetics helps with both of those things. I love putting those together, true and beautiful. That's what our world needs, to know that truth is a beautiful truth.
Yeah, that's great. So we've talked now about how parents can essentially train their kids and, help their kids grow. But I was curious, are there things about the gospel that you believe children actually are better at understanding than parents? I mean, the Bible has admonitions for people to become mature in their faith, but Jesus also tells us to become like children in some sense. Have you, in your experience as a parent, or since you started writing or speaking, have you sort of realized that, hey, actually kids have gotten this way better than I have?
I think that the humility that Jesus is talking about, at that time, to have, the faith like a child, sometimes people think that verse means that he's saying, oh, we don't need all this stuff. We just need to blindly believe. But that wasn't the context. The context is in having humility. And so I do think that kids have that humility, whereas adults kind of get to a point of, well, I know knowledge puffs up, they start to think that they know everything. And they forget that, there are plenty of things that we never will know. Whereas sometimes kids have a humility and a heart of just being able to say, well, I love God and I don't know everything, but I know that I love God. And that's a beautiful thing. And I love seeing that in kids. And I think that maybe even in general, just kids are better at understanding the love of God than adults. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that, but I think part of it is that adults have more life experiences that get mixed into what we have to process, right? So that's a natural part of life. We've experienced tragedies. We see so much of the bad in the world. And so sometimes if we don't have strong theology of how do we process evil and suffering in our world, a lot of times people get kind of thrown off by that. And they say, well, maybe God exists, but I don't see him as so loving. Whereas kids have a more of that God is love view, which is so important. But I would add to that too, that we don't want our kids to think that, it's all candy and roses. And so it's been important to me as a parent to not crush my kids' view of God being love, but to give them a rounder view that God's love, but he's also just and
Right.
he's holy and he's perfect and he's good. All of these things come together, which gives them a fuller picture of who he is. And it's important for processing some of these questions like, well, what about hell? And what about the evil that we see in the world? So I think that raising our kids with that understanding is important. We don't want that to take away from their understanding that God is love, but we want them to understand, that we don't just take that and say, well, he's nothing else.
Right. Okay, so I have one final, or you could even call it a bonus question. At the time of recording, it's 10 days left until Christmas. What's your approach to the whole Santa Claus thing?
When our kids were little, like I loved Santa Claus because when I was a kid, we did that. It had such good memories for me.
Sure.
And I loved it. I loved Santa Claus. So we always did Santa Claus. But when I don't know exactly how old they were, probably about 5 or so, my oldest ones, they were fairly little. And when we finally told them, what it was, I don't want to spoil it for anyone who's listening, but when we gave them the big news,
I'll put the warning out when I publish this,
trigger warning.
Spoiler alert.
When we gave them the big news, my daughter actually kind of had an unexpected reaction. And a couple of months after that, she was lying in bed one night and she was really upset about something. She was actually crying. And she said, and I never in a million years would have imagined this happening. She said, well, how do I know that God exists when you told me that Santa Claus isn't real?
Right.
I have to tell you, I was shocked because when I had heard Christians, those Christians out there who were like, oh, I would never do Santa Claus. It's too confusing for my kids. I don't want them to not trust me. I was like, oh, please. I love Santa Claus. I mean, it was like, a big burn moment. Like this actually happens. So I can say from firsthand experience that it can lead to some of that confusion. Would I say in retrospect, don't do Santa Claus? Probably not, but I wouldn't do it for very long when they get older. And then make sure that you do have those conversations. If you've done Santa Claus, that you unravel that a bit and say, this is kind of a fun story that parents do, but I want to make sure you understand that you can trust us and that there's nothing else that, that we're talking about like this. And I would even say, sometimes kids think, well, maybe the God doesn't exist, but that's a whole different kind of thing. And actually that's a perfect introduction to apologetics, because then you can say, there's no evidence that Santa Claus exists. I can show you how all of this happened, but there actually is tons of evidence that God exists. And I'm going to start teaching you about that. So you could actually use that as a segue as a parent.
Yeah, because it's an analogy that people try to push on us that, I don't believe in God or Santa or elves or whatever. And we just actually, our last episode of this podcast dealt with that analogy and how poor of an analogy it is. So, but thanks. It's just fun to hear. I know Christian parents have different approaches and different views, and I don't think it's that controversial, but I was just curious, so I wanted to ask you. So thank you for that.
Every year, though, I will get some kind of invitation that people just assume that I'm anti-Santa Claus because they think that if you're a serious Christian, then a serious Christian must absolutely not, do this. And it's just kind of funny to me because I'll get, please come and talk to our parents about why Santa Claus is such a bad thing. And I'm like, I love Santa Claus. Just a fun thing, but put within context and obviously not to take away from the season.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, Natasha Crain, thank you so much for your work, for your writing. It's our pleasure to have your book out in Swedish, and listeners, or I guess watchers who watch this on YouTube, they can find your website at natashacrain.com and find your blog there and more of your books that aren't yet translated into Swedish. And thank you for coming on this interview.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been my pleasure.